Well, folks, welcome to our very first Ask the Expert with Dr. Steve Krantz, who we know as CyberStevePhD. He has worked at IBM for a long time, so we're getting some incredible knowledge today. He's been a distinguished engineer, now retired, but now fortunately has enough time to come with us and teach us about all of this stuff that can make living in this digital world kind of scary. So, Dr. Steve, our Cyber Steve PhD, we're going to hand this off to you to walk us through what we need to know to stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Welcome, everybody. A little introduction for the organization I'm proud to volunteer for, SecureTheVillage. Our vision is a cyber secure global village, and that's a long-range goal, and hopefully little bits, things like an expert talk to help citizens protect themselves in cyberspace will lead us to that ultimate vision. So what we're doing at the person-to-person level is we are trying to turn people and organizations into cyber guardians. And a cyber guardian is someone or some organization that helps others be safe in cyberspace. So let me first start with a definition. What is personal cybersecurity? Because that's the subject of my talk this afternoon. And you can read the definition along with me. Maintaining control of personal information while using computers, smartphones, and other devices. That's how I define it. And the goals to achieve that are no unintended exposure of your personal information and to be secure wherever you operate on the internet, at home, at work, airports, public places, etc. So let me now take you to what I call a story of a cybercrime. And I hope you think when I go through the 5 steps of a cybercrime that you'll think of yourself as being the victim. And it affects me emotionally to think that I could have been a victim in this potential crime. So you can see that bad guy, that devilish face. He has sent a spam email, an email with malware. That little green guy is my way of describing malware. So you, as the person in the brown jacket with the old-fashioned computer screen, you open an email, you click on a link, which is something you shouldn't have done. Or you open an attachment, again, something you shouldn't have done. And what that does is that action that you take by mistake installs that malware on your computer. Step 2, that malware is now active and it allows the criminal to obtain login information when you try to get access to your bank. And you can see the ID. I used a Steve the Sucker ID and a password. As you can read, I'm a moron. And the bad guy picks that up. The malware picks that up and sends it to the criminal. And the criminal can then use the login information that was stolen and steal your money. And that's very painful. And there are many cases of individuals who've lost tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes their whole life savings, through this kind of a cybercrime. So let me now take you through a perspective of how to protect yourself, both at home and away. Starting from the bottom, you can see some equipment. You can see a laptop, you can see a smartphone image, and they connect to that rabbit-eared little black square with the 3 rabbit ears. That's an example of a router, which connects to the gray box above it, or the modem. And that's typically what you at home will have set up for your Wi-Fi network at home. And what you need to do when you set those up is you need a network ID, or your Wi-Fi network ID, also called an SSID. That name should not identify you, your home, or your family. It should be something different, something that's memorable, but not anything that someone else in the neighborhood would associate with you, because it's broadcast locally. And the password associated with that network ID should be something complex, memorable but complex, so that, again, it's hard for someone to discover. While you're setting that up, When you set up your router, you want to make sure it's got a firewall setting and that it's encrypting the traffic that goes through the router to the modem and ultimately above to that cloud, the internet. On the lower left, you can see some things that are important to do with your home systems. Number one, if you're working at home, use a virtual private network. If you're not sure what that is, those can be questions for later. But for ordinary work, it's not necessary. Your Wi-Fi is, if it's set up properly, will be encrypted and protect you. But for a work at home person, you should be investing in that. Similarly, your passwords should be complex, should be memorable, should be passphrases. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. 2FA, what does that mean? It's an acronym. It stands for two-factor authentication. In addition to using IDs and passwords when you log into your accounts on the internet, you want to activate two-factor authentication. And again, I will talk more in depth about that a little bit later. At home, you want to set up a lock screen so that when you walk away from your laptop or your desktop system at home, that it automatically locks and only you can, or the person who's using it can get back in. And also you might want to set up loss recovery, just in case you take your laptop with you, your smartphone with you. There are ways to do that also. And finally, at home, think about the software that's on your devices. You want antivirus active, running on both your laptop or your smartphone. You want to respond to requests to update the software from the manufacturer. So if you've got a Windows laptop, you want to pay attention when Windows says an update needs to be made. And you should probably set that to be an automatic update by the Windows operating system. And it works similarly for Mac computers. And it works similarly for iPhones, for example, and Android phones. When tune-ups are requested, follow the instructions from the manufacturer to do the tune-ups. And finally, backup and encryption. What backup means, if you have files that are important to you, you want to back them up, and you want to back them up remotely. And lastly, encryption. That's a setting that you can take on your devices to make your important files impossible for a scammer to understand, to analyze. That protects those important files. So that's a quick summary of what you can do to protect yourself at home. Now, you're in the outside world. What should you do? What shouldn't you do? And if you start on the right, I refer to a smartphone and a tablet. If they can communicate, and your phone by definition communicates. Tablets may or may not, depending on what you've purchased. They use the cellular data network. They're not on Wi-Fi when you're outside, in the outside world. And that is encrypted, so you're protected. But if you go to a Starbucks, if you go to an airport, you might be tempted to use public Wi-Fi. And I think that's too risky because it's not encrypted. And if you connect to those public Wi-Fis, those networks, to connect to ultimately to the internet, you're putting your device at risk. The device's security is at risk. So don't do it. So how do I communicate in the outside world? If I have the opportunity to use public Wi-Fi, again, you want to invest in a virtual private network because it is encrypted. So that's a quick summary of both at home and away of self-protections. Now, as I promised, I want to go into more detail on two-factor authentication. And here's a little diagram that talks about the steps that occur if you're not familiar with it. And I hope most of you listening to me are, and hopefully have established it as your standard way of communicating with important web services like your bank. So here from my laptop, step one is to log in. And I'm logging in this case, to my bank, Bank of America. But I've set up two-factor authentication with Bank of America. And what it will do in step 2 on the right is to send me a code. And it'll go to a different device, my smartphone. And I'll read that code. Usually it's sent by text. And I enter it on my laptop, and that gets, again, transmitted to the bank. And now I'm logged in. And that extra step is very protective and very important. Now, for a little more about it, so you use it if it's available. And it's especially when you're communicating or making changes to important online accounts, like, as I said, your bank or your investment company or credit card companies, for example. And so two-factor authentication, the two-factor comes from number 1, something you know, your username and password is factor 1, and factor 2 is something you have, your cell phone. And it enables you to give you much, much stronger protection when you're logging into important sites. A way to even improve that protection, there are specialized phone apps that link to many commercial websites. You can see them listed in the middle of this slide. Authy, Duo Mobile, and Google Authenticator are 3 examples of these specialized apps that provide even more protection than the two-factor authentication using a texted number that you enter from your phone to your home computer. And in general, you should minimize sharing of your cell phone with apps and websites, your cell phone number. And there's a concern, and I'll explain it a little bit. There are concerns called SIM swap attacks, where if someone knows your cell phone number, they can call your cell phone company and pretend to be you and say, send me a new SIM. And what that does is it essentially neutralizes your smartphone. And that person then, with that SIM, can install it in their smartphone, coupled with possibly knowing your ID and password. They can then defeat two-factor authentication. So be very careful with sharing your cell phone number, and make sure that your cell phone company, you have a PIN when you call your cell phone company. Lastly, on this slide, I talk about for those who are truly security concerned. They may be targets, they may be famous, they may be rich. The most secure approach to protecting yourself to get to websites and accounts on the internet is to use a piece of hardware. And this is an example called a YubiKey. And it's based on well-known, well-respected standards like the FIDO, Fast Identity Online Standards. And it's almost impossible for a hacker to pretend to be you and log in to your accounts, even if they have your ID and your password, because they don't have the physical key, which typically will identify you through a biometric value, like a fingerprint. They can't take over your accounts. So moving on, let me go over the top 10 list of things you should do to protect yourself on the internet. Number 1, freezing your credit. And many of you may not have heard of this. Freezing your credit prevents anyone to take out credit in your name. If they have your personal information and they go to buy a car or they buy a home, if they use your personal information, the credit bureau or the bank will want to check your credit rating. And they will go to one of the 4 credit bureaus, Experian, Equifax, TransUnion, and Innovis. Those are the 4. They will go and try to pretend to be you. If you've frozen your credit in advance, that prevents that. So it's a step that I recommend for everyone to take to prevent someone getting a loan in your name. And of course, if they get a loan in your name, they're not going to pay it back. The loaning company, the bank that's given you the loan, is going to come to you, and you're not going to understand why that happened. So freeze your credit at the 4 credit bureaus. It takes a few minutes. At each of the 4, the 3 of them give you a PIN. One of them uses two-factor authentication. So definitely invest your time in doing it. Number 2, two-factor authentication. The previous slide talked about that in detail. You do that, you set that up at your important online accounts, government accounts, banking, investments, credit cards. Number three, carefully clicking on attachments and links is a very important thing to do. If you get an email or a text, you want to be suspicious if you're not expecting that email or that text. And especially when you didn't expect it, do not click on attachments and links. Be sure of the source and that it's expected. Number four, keep your software up to date on all devices. And I did talk about that on an earlier slide. Pay attention to any prompts. Make sure that any prompts to update your software is coming from the manufacturer of the software. If it's a Windows computer from Microsoft, it's a Mac from Apple. You back up your critical files. Maintaining a remote multi-version backup of your computer files is very important, and it ultimately protects your files from being stolen and misused. Number six, make sure that your computer and smartphone has an antivirus software installed on it. Most computers and smartphones today come with that standard as part of the software operating system. What that will do is it typically will monitor any changes to files or memory and remove those viruses. It will be running on your computer while you are operating, and periodically it will scan files. Number seven, create passwords that are strong and unique on all your online accounts. I talked about that earlier. And number eight, as I said, encrypt your files. There are settings on your laptops to do this. You need to learn and invest and do that. The smartphones will typically do that by default. They will encrypt your files. So those are really the top eight, but there are two more that I call Steve's faves. Number nine, create a smartphone lock screen with an alternate phone number and email. And so for, everyone has a lock screen that they can set up on their smartphone. I'm recommending doing this, putting your significant other's telephone number on that screen, which you can do with a little bit of editing work, and your email address. If some good Samaritan finds your smartphone, if you've left it somewhere, if you've lost it, they can call that number, contact your significant other. In this case, it's my beautiful wife, and they can call and I can recover my phone. And last but not least, I recommend creating what I call a kick the bucket letter for your heirs. A kick the bucket letter is a list of all your online accounts, your IDs and passwords. You keep this very private and you give a copy to your significant other, one of your heirs, so that if anything happens to you, you're incapacitated or God forbid you pass away, that letter provides information to allow your loved ones to take over for you in your online life. Okay, let me now present the perspective that security is relative. I've gone over these top 10 items, but it's not absolute. It's relative. There is no completely secure, unfortunately. So I'm going to talk about three different areas and kind of walk you down what's the most secure in each of those three areas, what's in the middle, what I call mezzo secure, and what's the least secure. So let's talk about passwords. The most secure, and that's recommended by the federal government, is long pass phrases, as long as you can make them. In this case, I've got a humorous phrase, Spot likes belly rubs on his tummy. If you could use that as a password or a passphrase, do it. It's most secure because it's very hard for someone who is eavesdropping and gets the transmission, which will typically be encrypted. They won't be able to decipher it. They won't be able to guess it. Mezzo secure is something that if you use a password manager, it's what password managers create for a very hard to crack password. And it's unmemorable, but it's more secure than the least secure option, which sadly many people opt for, which is just to use the word password. They don't take password protection securely. So that gives you a perspective of what's the most secure, the mezzo secure, and the least secure. Now let's talk to the notion of accessing websites and accessing apps. The most secure, as I talked about earlier, is to get a hardware device like a YubiKey, plug it into your smartphone or your computer, and that provides the most secure protection, almost unbreakable. In the middle is two-factor authentication, and it's in the high 90s of protection and strongly recommended for most individuals. And the least secure is the ID and password, but of course, use a good password. That at least gives you some protection. And at the bottom row, talking about networks, I talked about virtual private networks. It's the most secure to protect your transmission from your home, or if you're using public Wi-Fi, to protect your interactions with the internet. In the middle, there are two. When you're at home, it's your home Wi-Fi if it's set up securely. And if you're in the outside world, the cellular data on your smartphone will give you protection. The least secure, and I don't recommend you do it, is to use public Wi-Fi. So that should give you some idea of what are the most secure, what's in the middle, what's the least secure. So ultimately, you should build a cyber guardian wall on your devices, because cybercrime is a reality for us and for businesses, sadly. Make yourself hard to impersonate. Invest in two-factor authentication and a notion that I call the 6 pins. And the 6 pins are pins for the 4 credit bureaus, a pin for your cell phone that will protect you from someone calling up your cell phone provider and pretending to be you. You need that private pin. And the 6th pin is an IRS identity protection pin, something that you could add to your tax submissions, and this is tax season, to prevent someone from submitting your taxes for their benefit. So know with whom you're communicating. And as I quote in red, Ben Franklin, one of our forefathers, distrust and caution are the parents of security. Sometimes you have to be distrustful. You have to be cautious to be secure. So be prepared, update your software, back up your data, and the bad guys go away. Any questions? You can send questions to me, steve@securethevillage.org, and I'll be happy to respond. For an in-depth reference, please consider buying my book, Cyber Guardian, A Secure the Village Guide for Residents, on Amazon. And thank you for attending.
That was some fantastic information, folks. We hope to see you at a future session with Ask the Expert and CyberStevePhD as he breaks down more complex topics to make them very easy to understand and actionable for you to go and make your world a little bit more cyber secure. So follow us on social media, of course, and wherever you like to learn. We will see you there.